Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Rooted in History panel. Osio, Mandi Harris Dagwedan, Jijaligi. Hello, my name is Mandi Harris, and I am a Cherokee Nation citizen, a children's librarian, a PhD student at the University of Washington Information School, and I have the joy of moderating this session. So while here in the States, the future is often spoken of as being ahead of us, in many Indigenous cultures around the world, we have our backs to the future because it is unknown to us. It is the past that is ahead of us. We face it knowing what it contains, bringing its knowledge and wisdom into an as yet unknown future. So today we face the past and we'll learn from these authors whose knowledge and creativity help guide us into that as yet unknown future. So I'm so pleased to welcome our panelists today. The first author I would love to welcome is Heather Clark, author of the Scrapbook, published by Pantheon. The Scrapbook is about remembering the legacies of World War II and the reverberations of the past told through a story of first love. Welcome, Heather. Our next panelist is Chanel Cleeton, the author of The Lost Story of Eva Fuentes, published by Berkley. In The Lost Story of Eva Fuentes, a missing book connects three women across decades and continents. Welcome, Chanel. Our next author is Vaishnavi Patel, and Vaishnavi is the author of 10 Incarnations of Rebellion, published by Ballantine Books. In the 10 Incarnations of Rebellion, we spend 10 years with Kalki in an alternate history of India as she forges a new future of freedom for her country. Welcome. And please join me in welcoming Patrick Ryan, author of Buckeye, published by Random House. Buckeye is at once sweeping and intimate as it tells the story of generations in a small town as history unfolds around them. And our final panelist is Maggie Stiefvater, author of The Listeners, published by Viking. In The Listeners, we find the creation of a magical new genre as World War II impacts the lives and loves of people in a rural West Virginia hotel. Thank you all so much for being here today. So, as I read through all of these marvelous and engaging books, as a librarian, I'm a children's librarian. If you can't tell by my whole vibe, I'm a children's librarian. And so as I read through all of these marvelous and engaging books, I couldn't help but picture Reader's Advisory. So that's when we connect these books with patrons in the library. And it made me think about what writers hope for when creating their worlds. So just as much as you are imagining the story, you are writing for an unknown imagined audience. And I would like to hear from each of you about how you envisioned readers engaging with your books as you wrote them. And so I think of stories as living things. People form relationships with them. So what do you envision for the lives of your books as they enter the world? And let's start with Vaishnavi.
Thank you for that introduction, Mandi. I'm so excited to be here. This is a tough question to answer for this book in particular because even though it's my third novel, it is the first book I ever had the idea for, and it was very much inspired by my family history of freedom fighting in the Indian independence movement. And so when I first thought of the story, it came to me for myself, and to try to engage with my family history and fill in a lot of gaps that existed because of both, deaths in the family and also secrecy around what happened in this moment. But when I finally had the opportunity to publish it, I was thinking very deeply about what does it mean to talk about revolution and rebellion in history in a way that's relevant for us today. And so that's not just personal family history or even independence history more broadly, but thinking about what themes in those areas are important for readers today. And so I was thinking a lot about violence versus nonviolence, sacrifice for family versus sacrifice for country. What does it mean to work within a corrupt institution and try to be improving the world in that space? And so a lot of the questions that were on my mind that I thought would be on readers' minds in this particular time period came to the fore using history as a lens. And so my goal was to very much use a historical alternate history story to connect readers to the present moment.
Thank you. I love all of those themes came through as I was reading the book. And I really love that it started with yourself as the audience and the themes that were important to you. You're connecting the audience with those. Thank you. All right, let's go to Maggie. What do you envision for the lives of your books as they enter the world?
I think of there being two different ways of engaging with stories, that you can either read a novel as a window or you can read it as a mirror. So you have this sense of looking out a window and seeing a world that's nothing like yours. And there's an enjoyment and a real pleasure in that. But then there's that matching pleasure of looking in a mirror and having that uncanny feeling of seeing truth reflected back at yourself and saying, oh, that's my world. I feel this way. And I think that when I dove into this, I was a history major. And so for me, history has always felt very accessible and very immediate and very real. And I knew that by placing it in history, there was a real sense that people would feel that they were going to be reading only a window novel instead of a mirror novel. So I really wanted to have that sense of, yes, there's still that joy in looking out the window and seeing that things are different, but also there's that real sense of, oh, but there is a lot of relatable, emotional landscape that we can traverse here. And the thing I most want people to take away is the idea that they visited the Avalon, the hotel, and when they close the pages of it, that they don't think I've read a historical novel, they think of a place instead.
I love that. I love that idea, like Rudine Sims Bishop says about mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. And then also what you said, about it can be both mirrors and windows. It reminds me, Manalani Aluli Meyer talks about we're all the same, but differently. And I think that's true when looking at people of the past. Thank you. And then Patrick, what do you envision for the life of Buckeye?
Thank you. I think for all of my books, I think of them as studies on how we can endeavor to treat one another better in general. And I feel like that kind of carries through everything that I write and attempt to write. Buckeye opens at a moment of the announcement of the Allied victory in Europe during World War II, and it focuses on four characters, two couples that live in a small Ohioan town. And it follows them through their lives as they become very intertwined following a moment of stolen passion. And when I was writing the novel, it was really important to me that readers become attached to and identify with these characters, so that when the characters ultimately do awful and destructive things and make some really horrible, bad decisions, the reader would understand how complicated human relationships are and how there's always an opening in there somewhere for empathy. So ultimately, I think I want readers to carry away from the book the value of being open to the world, and the notion that as much as we're defined by our good deeds, we're defined by what we do with our mistakes, just as important.
Something I've been contemplating lately is, after a discussion with a friend, is perfection. And my friend talked about how curiosity, when we seek perfection as people, we limit curiosity. And so I like that idea. As complex humans, we're never going to be perfect, but we can be curious and own up to our mistakes. And that those themes carried through Buckeye. Yes, thank you. And Heather, how about for you? What do you imagine for the life of your books?
Yeah, thank you, Mandy. So the Scrapbook is my debut novel. I come at fiction from a biography background. My last book was a giant biography of Sylvia Plath, so I'm a real rookie. But what I wanted the reader to take away, I wanted the reader to be immersed in the mood of this book, which is contemplative and disquieting. This is a book that takes place against the backdrop of World War II and the Holocaust, though it's mostly set in the 1990s. It asks big philosophical questions about love and war and art, and whether love and art have any redemptive power in a world kind of scarred by mass murder. So I wanted the reader to grapple with some of those big questions, but through the lens of a love story between two young people who are haunted by their traumatic national and family histories. Anna is a young American woman who is deeply in love with Christoph, a beautiful, intelligent, but emotionally walled off German man. And a lot of the narrative tension in the book surrounds the question of whether their relationship can survive as they bear witness to a brutal wartime history that won't stay buried.
And you feel that tension. right from the opening pages, even as, you know, there's this really intense love story. It's both intense and tense, and that carries through. Thank you. And Chanel, how about you? Tell us what you envision for the life of your book.
I love the premise that you have in the question about this idea that stories are living things and the relationship that we build with the stories that we engage in. And that's really the heart of the Lost Story of Eva Fuentes. It's about a book that kind of carries different characters on journeys throughout history, and it has a 100-year plus span of impact on the characters' lives. And for me, you know, as a Cuban American, my family came to this country as refugees in the 1960s. And I've always really been drawn, I think, because of that family history, to the idea of people, you know, kind of ordinary people that are caught up in extraordinary events and the things that they take solace in to get through those times, the things that empower them and inspire them. And for me, obviously, as a writer and a lifelong reader, you know, there's very little that I can think of that is as empowering and comforting as literature. And so I wanted this book to really celebrate the impact that stories have on our lives and that librarians and booksellers have on the community. It's really kind of my love story to books and to the legacy that they've given me and to others.
Thank you. And I like that idea of, you know, the everyday lives in history. We focus so much history on these great people, but history was made by average, everyday people. And so I really love that. These people who are living through history and making history. Thank you. All right, let's move on to some kind of themes and topics. And the first one I want to talk about is histories, both alternate and magical. So Vaishnavi, we're going to start with you. And in the 10 Incarnations of Rebellion, you've written an alternate history. And you say in your author's note, the British Empire learned lessons in their failures on the Indian subcontinent and used improved tactics to fight anti-colonial movements in their other colonies around the globe. 10 Incarnations of Rebellion is an alternate history that asks what might have been had the British used those tactics to prevent Indian independence. So many of our lives might have been changed if there had been some slight decision that had been altered in the past. And facts and histories as we know them hang on a delicate thread of past decisions. And so it was really interesting, as somebody who works in anti-colonial and decolonial analyses of literature personally, it was really interesting to consider a decolonial, anti-colonial history through an alternate timeline. And so what is the power and meaning in exploring India's independence through this alternate timeline, one in which rebellion is led by women in the 1960s?
I love this question, and it's because it gets to the heart of why I was drawn to the story in the first place. Decolonial movements and anti-colonial movements, I feel, are very much viewed as a thing of the 50s, 60s, in India's case, the late 40s, and they're considered in the past, over and done with. They don't really affect us anymore. And in America, it's not something that you see a lot in books or in historical fiction compared to, say, Western histories of, you know, conflicts in Europe and not what Europe was doing to the rest of the world. But those facts are the things that happened in those movements are historical fact. And while I find them very interesting, I think we know what happened, and it's almost is a little disrespectful to me to be trying to say, well, here's some people I've made up who are doing it better. And so part of why I wanted to take this alternate historical lens was to be able to play with fiction while still being very respectful of freedom movements that are the reason why I am able to be here speaking to you today. But I also think the reason why I wanted to highlight women in a particularly cut off and isolated city is because a lot of times the stories that we traditionally hear about independence movements are very great man focused. They are, you know, Mahatma Gandhi led India to independence, but it was actually hundreds of thousands of people who marched and rebelled and striked and boycotted that allowed us to get to independence. And if he alone had been out there, nothing would have happened. And so rooting it in these real people in this one city who are making these difficult day-to-day choices of how do I make money for my family while also fighting an oppressive regime, I thought actually spoke to the heart of what these independence movements were about, which is making personal sacrifices and very difficult personal decisions in order to have a dream of the greater good. And the one other reason I wanted to talk about this in an alternate history lens is because a lot of times we talk about anti-colonial movements as getting lucky, or it was actually just, the British didn't want to be there anymore. It was actually bad for the British, and so they wanted to leave for themselves. And that's not true. And using an alternate history framework both shows how it's not true, because you can bring real historical facts into this slightly adjacent world in order to illuminate it, but also it shows that independence and freedom movements are also inevitable, and they will also keep on happening until truly everyone is dead or independence is won. It's not a great man that is the reason why the world is decolonized. It is because millions and millions of people rose up. And so that was kind of why I wanted to both honor them and be able to tell a different story.
Thank you. Yes, it's a very compelling examination of, individual needs and individual sacrifice versus what we do for the community and the greater good. Thank you. I really appreciate that answer. And Maggie, yours is not an alternate history. It's a magical kind of, but it's a new genre. It's a new genre of alternate kind of a history. And so I love magical realism. It's how I try to live my life every day. And I, just infused with the magic that surrounds us every day. And to me, living in wonder is really one of the only ways to live. And as I was doing my research on the background of this novel, I found that this is your attempt to create a new genre that you call wonder, which you say should provoke more awe than terror. And so in the listeners, you combine history with awe to steep this novel in wonder. And so Maggie, tell us about wonder as a genre and how the listeners exemplify wonder.
Yeah, I love this question. It's impossible to look at my current debut, my adult debut, without looking at my previous work, which was coming of age in young adult, pun intended. And also with looking at what I was reading when I was growing up, which was all of these wonderful fantasies like Chronicles of Narnia and Wrinkle in Time, which look at the real world and very real grounded problems for these children. But they use magic as a way to make these problems amplified and more universal for anyone reading. So you might not be exactly in the same position as Meg, but because the magic is making it bigger, despite the fact that your father has not been stolen by an entity, you still have that sense of, this is a moment where I have to step up. And for the first time in my child life, I feel like I have a sense of autonomy that my parents they can't come and fix my problems for me. And so magic comes in and supports that very grounded reality. And magic in all of these middle grade stories, Dark is Rising, would come in and it would always lead to the sense of the world getting bigger. They were always coming of age narratives. And so magic was this very positive force. And then in young adult, it has this tendency as teen years get to be a little more crunchy. The magic also gets a lot more crunchy. We have dystopian futures where you just think, oh, everything's not going to turn out all right. And then by the time we get to the adult world, when magic is brought into the real world, we get horror instead, for the most part. If it's really grounded fiction, when something that we don't understand comes in, it's awful and it pushes us to the wall to become a different version of ourselves. And I wanted to just think about, is there a way to bring in some of that wonder from the youth? Because like you said, you live your life like magical realism every day. My experience of adulthood isn't that everything has gotten worse. I hated being a kid. I had no agency as a child and everything was terrifying and awful. And I just hated it. I couldn't wait to be a grown up. And as a grown up, I love it. I feel like I get to be the kid that many other people got to be when they were kids, because now I feel like I have such a better playful understanding of the world. So I wanted to really bring that into a genre where I don't know if I would call the magic in the listeners magic. I would say it's myth. It's definitely, it underpins reality so in such a mimicking kind of way and a mirror kind of way that the rules of the world mimic the rules of the magic.
Oh, I really like that. The rules of the world make the rules of the magic. That's fantastic. Thank you. I appreciate that. So now moving from alternate histories and mythical underpinnings to the world genre histories, we're going to talk about time and place. So a lot of my work, I use indigenous systems of knowledge when I look at literature. And one perspective within that framework is land being a place-based series of relationships. And so I would love to hear from some of our authors today about the relationships between character and place. And so I'll begin with Chanel. Chanel, each of us is a product not only of, these personalities that we might have been born with or nurtured into, but also of the time and the place in which we live. So in the lost story of Eva Fuentes, we meet these three distinct women, and they're all connected in various times of place through this lost story. And we meet them in moments of chaos and opportunity and settings. So Margot's racing through the streets of London, and Pilar is in her apartment building in Havana, and Eva's in the hustle and bustle of a classroom. And then from this moment that we meet them, they're each so distinct. So these settings can speak to who they are and the choices they're making. And so what's your process for creating these characters? How does the time and place in which they live each influence their characterizations?
So time and place is really central to, when I'm building my characters. I came to writing historical fiction really as using it as kind of a window into my family's past and looking at kind of what my ancestors would have lived through. I started, with revolutionary and post-revolutionary Cuba, and then I've had the ability to kind of move throughout time and learn about different periods in Cuban history. And I'm always really drawn to, as I mentioned earlier, kind of the experiences that we find in the historical record of perhaps the people that are not as much, covered in the historical narrative, women in particular, kind of ordinary women that are going on throughout their lives, and how much the both kind of macro level world events affect them, but also how they interact just in their personal lives and in their families and in the social structure in which they are navigating, different challenges. And what I find really interesting about that is the parallels that you find across history, the struggles that women face, the ways that they kind of assert their agency, within the structures that they're operating in. You find obviously differences, but you find so many similarities. And I really like to play with that with my characters, to kind of honor how much the past informs the present and how much we can learn from our ancestors and from the decisions that they've made and, the struggles that they've faced. And so that's always something I try to honor in my work and really kind of center when I'm looking at my characters and how their lives are sort of celebrated and brought onto the page. I love the idea of books being a window and a mirror, both that Maggie mentioned. And, I want people to see their experiences represented in my novels. And that's always one of the most powerful, things that I have. And also kind of understanding that, you might not be Cuban American, but you would still find parallels in your own experience. And I love that kind of connection that comes out not only between characters, but also between readers and authors and the book community at large.
Yes, I think when stories are rooted in specificity, the more they're rooted in specificity, the more universally relatable they are. Yes. Thank you. And then, so Patrick, my next question is for you. And in your novel, we see the passage of time and how geography and geology and human lives, they're all inextricably linked. I was thinking about this when you kind of capture the magnitude of the passage of time in this small passage at the beginning, when you're talking about the town and how it was founded in a northwest pocket of Ohio in 1857 by a small group of merchants and their families on land transformed by the last ice age when a glacier nudged its way down from Canada and melted, creating not only Niagara Falls and the Great Lakes, but also a vast swamp across the top of Ohio and Indiana that took 30 years to drain and left behind soil densely ripe for farming. First of all, thank you. As a West Coast girl, I did not know any of that about the history of Ohio and Indiana. I was like, wow, oh, cool. Didn't know that. I'm gonna have to tell my dad. He'll find that very interesting. And then, but it's also, it takes this magnitude of time that it takes for the landscape to form. And it echoes this thought that we don't really think about, the millennia that it took to form the landscapes on which we live that determine why we live here and how we live here. So I'm curious, how for you does this reciprocal relationship between the town of Bonamy and its residents drive the narrative of Buckeye?
Thank you for that. That sentence that you quoted, by the way, I'll just say, I think I worked on that sentence for about 3 weeks. and it went through about 50 drafts. So it's very pleasing to hear it come out of someone else's mouth. Of the four main characters that are in Buckeye, two of them were born and raised in this little town of Bonamy, and two of them moved there in adulthood. So for the characters of Cal and Becky, their worldviews are shaped by the fact that they grew up in this community, where they've been isolated, not only isolated from the world, but where they've always been told in one form or another that what's happening out in the world is coming for them. And that's always this consistent message that kind of pins everybody where they are, if they allow it to. For the character of Felix, who has a big buried secret, moving to the small town provides him with an opportunity to hide from a previous life and live as someone he isn't. And then for the fourth main character, Margaret, she grew up in an orphanage and then landed in early adulthood in Columbus, Ohio. So for her, that was the big city, and it opened up the world for her. So when she is then forced to relocate to Bonamy, it brings her life to a grinding halt. So all four of these characters, I feel like their lives are defined in different ways by the size of the town they live in and by its accessibility to the outside world. I'll add that I had to make a decision early on about whether or not I wanted to use an existing town or create a town. And I have had the experience in the past of working with an existing community, and there are some real drawbacks to it, such as worrying about which direction you get the traffic flow on a certain street or something like that. Once I decided it was best to create a town, I felt this great responsibility to not only make it the town that I wanted and the town that I feel like the novel needed, but also to make it as real as possible in the context of itself and in the context of the world surrounding it. So I spent a lot of time researching the nuances of life in the US during the 40s and 50s and 60s to understand why their characters had lives the way that they did in that second half of a pretty turbulent century. Not that this one is not turbulent so far. And to get to a grasp on the collective mentalities of small American communities, so that when the tensions among all the characters build and when everything comes to a head, how they deal with the central crisis in the book and what they do with it going forward, I feel is heavily informed by and affected by living in this one same small community.
And even the name of the town.
Really?
Yes, I was like, oh, well, how perfect for the themes of the book. I really love that, these themes that come through in all of these facets. Yes, and then Heather, my last question on this topic is for you. So the scrapbook opens with love, and it is an intense, immediate, infatuated love. And there's tensions from the beginning. So Anna's friends express concern over Kristoff, and to be frank, as a friend, I would have too, over this like really intense head over heels love. And there's also tension in that mirrors the tension in the novel around memory. And so Kristoff and Anna have this discussion about remembering potentially being a form of forgetting or of absolving individual responsibility, because when it's all around you, it loses its force. Individual responsibility perhaps becoming lost in the shadow of national and institutional memory. So can you speak to these relationships between memory, responsibility, and culture, especially as it relates to this time period that's the novel set in, which is the mid-1990s?
Sure, yeah, this is a great question. Well, this novel was partly inspired by my own grandfather's experience as a young GI. He was in the unit that helped liberate Dachau. So there's some family history there. But when I spent time in Germany in the 1990s, I was unnerved by how few memorials I saw of the war and the Holocaust. And I remember sitting in these charming German squares thinking about how the country had been in ruins just 50 years before, and how millions of people had died because of this war that Germany had started. And it was very unsettling for me then, you know, sitting at these cafe tables with my German friends, thinking that our grandfathers might have tried to kill each other. You know, 50 years before, it sort of messed with my mind a bit. And you know, today there are many, many museums and memorials about the Holocaust in Germany. It's a completely different landscape. There are Stolpersteins everywhere, memorial cobblestones with the names of murdered Holocaust victims in front of their last known address. So, you know, it's a totally different landscape today. But that reckoning really began in earnest in the 1990s as Germans learned more about the atrocities committed by the Wehrmacht, which was the regular conscripted army, particularly the atrocities in the East. So I wanted to write about that particular historical moment 50 years after the war, when memories of that time were fading, and yet it was still this great shadow. So my German character, Christoph, is caught between two ways of understanding the past. Should he look backwards or forwards? And Anna helps him navigate his own inheritance, just as he navigates his country for her. He takes her around Germany. So they're learning from each other. They're bearing witness to this horrific history that they've both, to a certain extent, ignored until they meet each other. Christoph jokes that he's giving Anna what he calls a German education, but there's some truth to this. His feelings about Germany and the Holocaust make Anna think a lot harder about the atrocities committed against African Americans in the past in her own country. So, yes, I wanted to write about memory and memorials and bearing witness and striking the right balance between looking and looking away. How do we move forward without forgetting or denying the past? That's one of the book's main philosophical questions.
Yes, like you say, looking and looking away, and then also looking inward as well. So thank you. I appreciate that. And now I want to talk about what I'm calling lyrical openings. So Vaishnavi, I would like to hear from you about the power of music. So when we first meet Kalki, she's on a mission of music. She's at a city hall and she finds this file room filled with contraband songs, and they take her back to memories of childhood and of her baba and the songs that he sang to her as he taught her these skills of rebellion, really. And she thinks about how benign the songs are, but they must be something to be feared because they've been banned. So there's power in them. And she begins her rebellion with music. I try not to give it too much away, but it gives her this buoyant feeling of defiance. And then she goes on to rebel against the policing of relationships, of bodies, of desires, of land, and of free movement. So what drew you to music as a connection between characters and then also as the seed of rebellion?
Yeah, so this is very, I think, personal to me on two levels. So I think that music and art more generally, you know, its purpose is to entertain and educate, but it also serves as a store of living memory long after the artist or the that time period of from where a piece of art is from has passed. And it gives us such an immediate connection, and not just music, but you know, dance, visual art, literature, all of these forms of art store memory. And for me personally, my life has been influenced so substantially by music. So I'm a civil rights lawyer. I'm, you know, in my 20s, so relatively young in this career. And but I remember a piece of music that I heard in middle school that, like, you can kind of trace the points from there to me deciding I'm going to go to law school and I'm going to be a civil rights lawyer. And that was Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit, which I heard in a eighth grade history class. And something about that piece of music just touched me. And then I became consumed with learning about lynching and then the civil rights movement. And then it just sort of snowballed. But it was because that one piece of music contained so much pain and memory in it and had the ability to reach through almost a century and touch me. And that's the same thing for, I think, independence movements and freedom movements, but also just cultural heritage generally. And so the second stream is that my great grandfather was a freedom fighter and he died as a result of he was imprisoned and died shortly after being released because of the treatment he had received. And so his story was carried on through oral tradition and through pieces of literature that he loved that were passed to my grandmother and then to my mother and then to me. And so through both of these streams, art has been the carrier of memory and of passion and of a desire to fight back against injustice. And so it just felt right to me that this character should start out her journey searching for a song that she remembers and that her father remembers because someone sang to him. And that is how rebellion has been carried through the generations.
Oh, I love that. Music as a carrier of passion and a desire for freedom. Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. And now I would like to talk about the melodic power of opening lines. So a first sentence is an introduction, and it can become iconic. It can be the best of times and the worst of times. It can be a truth universally acknowledged. So from the opening line to Buckeye, I was caught up in this world. Like I read that first line and I stopped and I said, oh, I'm going to love this. I just knew instantly, I'm going to love this book. I love that first line. And the first line is, Cal Jenkins was born in the spring of 1920 with one leg shorter than the other. So this town of Bonamy is filled with these lovable and intensely flawed human characters. Becky's my personal favorite, not to unduly influence anyone in the audience. But the opening of this book, how does this opening sentence inform the narrative and the themes of Buckeye?
Oh, well, thank you very much for that. And this, I love this question. Everybody keeps saying we love your questions, so you're doing this fantastic service for us. I have these aspirations for myself for opening lines, and one of them is to try to start with an action, and if possible, to try to start with a fact that a reader is not inclined to argue with. And so I introduce the character Cal by stating the year he was born there, and by stating for the reader a fact that in his mind is his defining characteristic, this thing about his leg. And part of the journey over the course of the novel for him is learning that his short leg is not his most defining characteristic. And something else about the opening, if I can add, I have never before written an omniscient narrator out of fear. And I knew once I came up with the whole scope of this novel and what I wanted to do, I knew that an omniscient narrator was going to best serve it. So I told myself, if I could establish that in the first 2 paragraphs with an omniscient narrator, then the whole book could be written that way and I would get over my fear. So I brought in right in the first paragraph, this boy, a classmate of Cal's, and I knew he would never appear again. It's just this little walk-in cameo. And in the second paragraph, I start off with the words, what the 2 of them found out separately and years later. And when I wrote that word separately, I thought, yeah, that's it. That's my signature on this contract, because I'm now saying that this narrator is going to show you something Cal isn't aware of, but Cal is clearly the main character. And it was a wonderfully eye-opening and liberating thing. And I feel like I kind of tricked myself into the confidence of it, but I also feel like that's what confidence is just a trick. But I send the boy to war and I kill him horribly in the second paragraph, and Cal doesn't know that. Cal doesn't know how he died. Cal didn't see it, and the narrator did. So that was my attempt to say to the narrator, just in the first 2 paragraphs, that this is the kind of storytelling you're in for. And then within like the first page or so, I've gone from 1920 to the mid 1930s to 1941. And so I was hoping that too would project or indicate rather that we're in for the coverage of some time. So that was why I opened it the way I did.
Thank you. I love that. And I love that this is your attempt to get over fear, this challenge to yourself.
Everything is an attempt to get over.
That's incredible. And that's a good inspiration for me. So now we're going to shift over to frameworks. So Maggie, I am often struck by the small details in a book that speak to a character, who a character is. So in the opening scene of The Listeners, June wakes up and she displaces three dachshunds from their bed. But you have this clarification, two are smooth, one's wiry. And it made me laugh. And it also conveys this like information about June. And the book is filled with these delightful asides and also enumerated lists of things, including 3 live snails under a couch at one point. And that's, just, oh, there's 3 live snails. They're compact, these details, but they add so much richness. So how do you go about choosing these small details of information about a character or setting, these finely pointed aspects that make a person and place come to life?
I'm going to answer this question by saying I've been counting down the 90 days to when The Listeners is coming out by drawing a dachshund every single day. I told everyone I was going to do this, and they didn't see my vision. They see my vision now. Okay, so I've been drawing. I have them here on the desk because there's a huge stack. Can we do this? Right. So you see there's dachshunds there. That's right. We've got, okay. There's a dachshund there. Here's George Washington. Oh, he's got a dachshund, right? We've got some dachshunds. I mean, there's a lot of them. There's like 60. We're not going to do all of these things. Napoleon's got a dachshund. Right. Okay. So I've been doing these every single day, and I set a timer for myself. I'm not allowed to spend longer than 2 hours working on these dachshunds. And so they had to be very tiny. And what's interesting is that, so I was an artist before I was an author. And it's so interesting how when you're studying these great masterworks that maybe I hadn't spent so much time with beforehand, when you're actually forced to recreate them, you can see how noisy they are. They're full of details, which is intentional because the world is noisy and that art is subtractive. In order to create a certain mood, you have to remove details because you want to create a very intentional sensation inside either the viewer or the reader. So you're always stripping these details away, which means in these masterworks that are full of details, they've put these details back or they've specifically chosen to not take them out. And I feel the same way with The Listeners. The Listeners is novel number, I don't know, 15. How many books have I don't know. I've written a lot of books. So this book, though, is the one that I worked the absolute hardest on. I spent years on it. It's my adult debut. And one of the things that I thought about the most is I'm thinking about those edges of the canvas to make sure that it can be as noisy as possible. So I'm evoking as much mood as possible, but I'm also being so mindful about my prioritization to make sure that when you're doing something, which is massive noisy strokes, says Monet, that I'm still guiding that eye through there because I'm blurring the correct details and bringing them into focus. So when I'm choosing something like the dachshunds, it's to say something about June, but it's always that balance of you don't want to say so much that people expect that it's going to be a novel about dachshunds. I love what you said, Patrick, that sense of promising the reader in those first 2 paragraphs of what kind of story it's going to be. This is going to be a story where the narrator knows more than Cal does. So going and saying, this is going to be a noisy, lush canvas full of brushstrokes, but I'm going to lead you through to a story of June. So yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I love that you brought it back to what Patrick said. And yes, like telling the reader, hey, this is what we got going on for the next few hundred pages. Welcome to my world. I love that. And I just want to let the audience know we're probably going to go about 2 minutes over, but I'm having such a great time talking to our panelists today that I could honestly, if I didn't have a plane to catch, we could spend hours. I'd grab some coffee and we'd just keep chatting. But Heather, I have my next question for you. And I probably shouldn't share this publicly, but when I was a kid, I used to diagram sentences for fun. I find structure really fascinating, punctuation, sentence structure, the shapes of a paragraph. And I'm struck by the form of your novel, the Scrapbook. So you don't use dialogue markers, and many of the sentences, they're short, they're succinct, they're clear. And it really, the sentence structure mimics the scenes themselves. They're spare, but they're really evocative and descriptive, and it creates this distinct mood and attention. So how did you arrive at this structure for the Scrapbook? And what influenced these stylistic choices and the relationship between style and narrative and themes in the novel?
Well, thank you, Mandy, for kind of noticing that. That's what I was going for, just a mood. My first sentence is, I crossed borders for him, and then boom. So I was very influenced by Hemingway's writing style. Hemingway is the first writer I fell in love with. I read The Sun Also Rises and In Our Time when I was about 12, and it was over for me, right? I just never looked back. He lodged himself in my literary consciousness at a young age. And I would also say for the scrapbook, I was influenced by the style of W.G. Sebald and Annie Ernaux. But getting back to Hemingway, A Farewell to Arms is one of my favorite novels of all time, and it was a huge influence on both the style and substance of the scrapbook. I mention A Farewell to Arms a few times in the novel. It connects my 1940s plotline to the 1990s plotline because this is a book that moves backward and forward in time. We get the stories of Anna and Kristoff's grandfathers while they fought in the war. So Anna, Kristoff, and Anna's grandfather all read A Farewell to Arms. Anna and Kristoff discuss it, and they both admire the way Hemingway writes about war without sentimentality. And I, in turn, challenged myself to write about war in the same way without sentimentalizing it, especially in the scenes involving the soldier grandfathers set in the 1940s. So the style of the book was very important to me. This is a novel about two very heavy emotional subjects, love and war. Anna and Kristoff's conversations are filled with passionate emotions that are just under the surface. So I challenged myself to write about these very intense, very strong emotions in the most understated way that I could. So there's a constant stylistic tension between the characters' big, unexpressed emotions that have to do with love and pain, and the subdued, quiet, spare way that they talk to each other. Something is always being held back in their dialogue. So the style acts as a check on emotions that threaten to overwhelm Anna and Kristoff, and also the reader. So yes, style plays a very important role thematically in this book. It's a reflection of this theme of disquiet that animates so many of my characters' conversations. And I would say that the medium is a big part of the message in the scrapbook.
Brilliant, brilliant mini lecture on craft there. I really appreciate that. And I also shouldn't share, but on a family road trip when I was a kid, I had a crush on Hemingway and I made my family pull over and catch him. And I have some very pretentious 15-year-old pictures of me at 15 posing with Hemingway's grave. So I understand that. All right, Chanel, I really want to talk to you about the genres that you've melded in your book. So in The Lost Story of Eva Fuentes, we have love stories and travel narratives, a literary treasure hunt. It's a paperwork novel. And so because it's driven around this archival knowledge of a book. And it really reflects life, how our lives are never one thing, but many different stories brought together. So I would love to hear about your approach to your craft. How did you weave together these multiple facets from different genres?
So I would say that, much as The Lost Story of Eva Fuentes is really a love story to books, my writing career is really informed and inspired by my life as a reader. I didn't come to writing from kind of an academic background that lent itself to that. And so that passion for books is always at the core of my writing. And so I really like to work in genres that I enjoy reading, to be honest. And I feel like when I'm doing that, it really gives me an opportunity to stretch as an author. You learn so much from, reading outside of your genre. I feel like fantasy does such a great job with world building. Romance does this amazing job with dialogue and with tension. Suspense obviously helps you bring kind of that intensity and immediacy to the page that keeps the reader, flipping the pages quickly. And so I really like the adventure of being able to play with different genres. And I find that when I weave them together, it really adds to kind of this rich tapestry of my character's interior and exterior world. And so you get to see, not just the introspection, but also the physical and the tangible connections that they have. And you get to engage your senses on kind of a higher level when you bring in all those different elements and really place the characters into the setting and into the story. So for me, working with different genres is just something I've kind of loved from the beginning. And it's always fun for me to kind of take that multidisciplinary approach and to kind of give my readers that transportive, part of the experience when they're reading a novel.
Oh, and I love what you say about reading widely and how reading widely has informed your work and you're weaving together You've got all these threads of your reading experience that you're weaving together, and we get the benefit in this. Oh, this book was so fun. Like, I wish I'd read it, more in like July with some lemonade outside and a flowing dress, but alas, I read it in April in the rain. So I just want to thank all of our panelists today. I've learned so much from all of you. I'm very much, my inner nerd is just having a party, throwing confetti. This was wonderful. I want to say wado, thank you to all of you. Thank you to our speakers and to all of the librarians for joining us today. Next, we have 3 concurrent panels, a culinary celebration in conversation with DK's cookbook creatives, between the panels, middle grade graphic novels, and small presses, big scares. So, Donadago ha'i, until we meet again, thanks to all of you, and have a wonderful day, everyone.